Hi, folks. We are talking about racism this week, which is the last part of our race unit that we've been covering the past 3 weeks. We're going to get into some heavy topics today, so I just want to kind of front load that and provide trigger warnings. Today, we are going to talk about racist violence, particularly with lynching and its connection to the long history of racism. This unit is very important for us to understand or to go through, because as we go over the history of various marginalized groups or minoritized groups in the United States, we are going to understand that their differential treatment is specifically because of the overarching racism in our society. With that, I'm not accusing anybody particularly of being racist in this classroom, nor am I saying that all white people are racist. However, we live in a racist society, and many of the structures and many of the institutions in our society do lead to different outcomes for people of color in a way that does not allow them to be fully human or ensures that they're not granted the same types of privileges and rewards as other individuals have, namely the dominant group, which is namely whites. Right? So, today we're going to cover racism, mechanisms of racism, forms of racism. We're going to look at scientific, medical, institutional, and systemic. We will also be looking at interpersonal and internalized racism. And I provided a quick definition here of what racism is, but I wanted to go first into this set of pictures so we can understand what I mean by how the differential treatment of people of color over time has been structured through this idea of racism. So we covered this in the first week on race, when we were thinking about the mistreatment of the four historically marginalized communities. So that's going to be, again, Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinx and Chicanx folks. And so, although the first three pictures you see above are, artistic depictions, this is a kind of gross characterization of Asian Americans. But clearly in all four cases, we see some kind of white person in a dominant position over a person of color, right? And one thing I think is central to all four histories, legacies, and issues is the fact that these separate communities have all been exploited for the sake of agriculture, right? So here we can see indigenous people who've been enslaved, working in agriculture, African Americans here during the chattel slavery period or the antebellum period. Here we see Chinese workers during the coolie labor system, and then these are Latinos in the Bracero program. So fundamentally, we've created a social understanding of their difference and their inferiority to relegate them to a particular position or particular labor, in this case, in our society, right? Which is, again, manual labor, hard labor, agricultural labor. All of them can kind of be conflated here, right? So racism is the belief and or ideology, right, that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another, right? And so oftentimes what we've seen in this case, and if we go back to our previous slide, is we have distinguished these individuals as inferior and different from the dominant group for exploitation. And if we go further back to the conversation or to the conceptualization of race by Carl Linnaeus, remember that he created the four categories of man. I mean, there has been the construction of five, but originally there was the construction of the four races of man. Homo Americanus, Homo Asiaticus, Homo Europaeus, and Homo Afer. Of all four groups, the one that is defined as being most civilized in its social categorizations, because remember, the first thing that they're tagged with is a color. The one that's considered to be the most civilized are whites, where all other groups are considered to be a variety of things, including obstinate, choleric, governed by opinion, lustful, lazy. so on and so forth, right? And a lot of those conceptualizations or a lot of those categorizations by race in terms of their social understanding inform a lot of our stereotypes today, right? So the inferiorization of these communities, right, in this conversation or in this long history has created the conditions where they will be subordinated. Just for context, an ideology is a system of beliefs and ideals, especially one which forms the basis of economic, political theory and or policy. Okay, so when I'm talking about racism here as an ideology, racism and ideology actually informs policy. So we won't see it today, but in our next lecture, I'm going to get into the weeds on this a little bit and show you lots of examples of different outcomes for communities of color within like health, education, so on and so forth. And those particular disparate outcomes or those different outcomes are as a result of policy. So even if the policy in and of itself does not necessarily explicitly mention race, although there are many of our earlier policies in the United States that were talking about race explicitly, these policies still have different outcomes for people of color, which because of the way in which we understand racism here, we need to understand that the creation of difference and the creation of a inferior racial category groups means that those individuals that are having less or having different outcomes that are harming them in some way is creating or is because of this racism, right? Racism is saying you are less than, you are not an equal member at the table, and therefore you do not get as much, or you're going to be mistreated, okay? What racism leads to is prejudice, discrimination, and or antagonism directed against a person or people based on their membership to a particular racial or ethnic group. Remember that I've argued here that race and ethnicity can be or are seen similarly, right? That foreign ethnicities are treated as inferior to whites because of the cultural assimilation model and this idea that American culture is better than all others. And as a result, we value and view ethnicity within the same prism as race, right? And so those folks that are discriminated against or have this antagonism directed towards them are usually from a minority and marginalized group. This is something very important for us to also understand, that generally, right, that there is prejudice in society across a variety of contexts, and I'll talk about prejudice a little bit later in this lecture. However, what I want to say is that minority groups generally do not have the social power to be fundamentally racist towards individuals, because their actions will not lead to different outcomes for, and I mean in the life chance and social understanding for white people. So when we think about individuals having like a cultural biases, this is true, right? Like we can say that, you know, whites do certain things, African Americans do certain things, indigenous people do certain things. That is a bias, and it can be still informed on prejudice. But the reality is that most individuals from the dominant group, although I'm sure think that they are being harmed when maybe somebody makes an offhanded joke by whites or by minority groups for the most part are still the ones that are going to bear most of the brunt of racism, meaning that their communities are going to have more effects, have less access to goods and resources, and will not be as successful as whites, despite the fact that they'll do a lot of stuff. And we're going to see this a little bit later when we look at how wealth inequalities emerge. Okay, so there are several mechanisms of racism. We talked a little bit about them in the previous slide, but I wanted to kind of explain them more here. So discrimination is the first one. So these are social barriers rooted in racism and prejudice. Discrimination usually are behaviors that deny members of a subordinate group access to the resources or rewards that the dominant group can access or can. And so what that means is when we're in a social situation, generally those that are being discriminated do not have full access to the resources that others do. And if we go back to the intersectionality argument from last week where I was explaining the disparate outcomes for women of color compared to white women. That is, a sense, racism, right? So if white women charged with the same crime are not getting as severe of a punishment for similar crimes as African American women, that is racism in effect, right? Racism is saying these Black women do not have the same privilege or will not be treated the same as white women, and therefore, right, they're getting these different outcomes. Okay, this is true in a lot of other cases. We're seeing this right now with Haiti and the border. Obviously, there are a lot of both African Americans and undocumented immigrants that are being treated far harshly, and Haitians being of Afro descendancy in this case, than whites, right? And so again, that is racism in effect, right? We're seeing individuals from certain communities being treated more harshly by law enforcement than whites. Okay. Stereotypes can often inform and help to structure discrimination. So stereotypes, positive or negative, are widely held, but fixed and oversimplifies images or ideas of a particular person or a thing, right? And there are lots of examples out there, from the way in which immigrants speak broken English, to understandings of criminality or innate criminality for individuals. Those are all examples of stereotypes that are in there. I've talked about this a little bit too. These can also be positive, right? So we have seen people make assumptions about athleticism for people of color. Mexicans are good at soccer, African Americans are good at basketball, Asian Americans are good at math, right? All of those things can be considered to be positive, but they are still a stereotype. They are still structured in dehumanization. And what it does do when we conflate individuals, even to positive stereotypes, can also lead to harm in those communities. Because if we, for example, say that all African Americans are good at basketball, when an individual isn't as good as that, or isn't good at a sport or something that has been tied to that particular stereotype, they may seem as inauthentic. So maybe they're not really considered, or maybe they're not fully African, or maybe they're African American, or they're not a good African American, or they can be considered a traitor to their race, right? And this has been very common. I'll talk about this a little bit later when we get into like more interpersonal and colorblind racism, is this idea of making false associations of individuals, cultures and abilities, with a larger group, and as a result, that actually is harmful to them. Okay. With that, we've also seen aspects of displacement. So racism tends to stem from a misassociation of social frustrations with a specific community. So when we face economic woes in the United States, for example, so let's say people are not getting jobs, so the economy is slumping, something like that. Oftentimes, rather than looking at the system that we're enmeshed in, i.e. capitalism, we will often displace that onto other communities. So historically, and I'll show this a little bit more when we get into each of the, again, the four historically marginalized communities, we oftentimes will say that those folks are the issue that that our society has, right? So immigrants, people of color, so on and so forth, are the issue, rather than saying that the issue is actually the system of capitalism or the system of policing in the United States, whatever that looks like, right? That in itself is what we call scapegoating, right? Or an individual blame for societal wrongs not of their doing. This is very, very common of immigrants. We often welcome immigrants in mass, but then when we face some kind of political or economic turmoil, we blame immigrants and then therefore, take steps to deport them or remove them. And then prejudice is an assumption or opinion about someone simply based upon that person's membership to a particular group. Now, we can say that there is prejudice both ways. So, I mean, people can be prejudicial and want to not associate themselves with folks from the dominant group. But I still want to argue, and I still want to be very clear that folks in the dominant group still hold all social power, right? There are more white people in houses of government, in or heads of major corporations, law enforcement, so on and so forth, right? So we are not in a position to say that even if people of color were prejudicial to those individuals, albeit they may not be able to, white folks would not be able to associate with people of color, the reality is that those folks still hold all major power, and that doesn't harm their social position. When whites are prejudicial towards people of color, and this ends up leading to discrimination, for example, so like those folks not getting hired, maybe they're being overly targeted by police, their concerns are not being addressed in legislative bodies when it comes to passing laws and policies. The people of color are the marginalized group in that case, are actually going to have less life outcomes compared to whites, right? And so that's what I want to be very clear, that when we're talking about racism, we're still considering that there is a dominant group. That dominant group holds particular beliefs about people of color, which we've talked a lot about the past 2 weeks, which has always been about inferiorizing people of color. And the prejudice and discrimination that is deployed against people of color impede their ability to have the same social, economic, and political outcomes as whites, right? Even if all people of color today came together and said, we're gonna not like white people, it would not be enough to essentially derail white folks from power. There are still more white people in the United States, and they hold more power positions in the society comparatively. And so it would be a hard fought battle to be able to unseat that power, right? We just don't have the numbers, nor do we have the actual political power or economic power for that matter. So one thing that we have to understand is race, particularly the marginalization of people of color, is maintained through various forms and systems of violence: physical, psychological, emotional, and sexual. Okay, so colonizers in the Americas, both British and Spanish and Portuguese, did use both overt physical violence, so they actually beat people, and they engaged in sexual assault. And so both tools were weapons of war, essentially, to destabilize these communities. I apologize for the graphic images here on the right, but I wanted to show these for one particular reason. If we look at both sets of pictures, so on the top, you can see a picture of two Mexicans lynched. On the top right, you can see a picture of an African-American lynched. Down on the bottom, you can see an example of two Latino boys who have been beaten and stripped of their clothes during the Zoot Suit riots. And on the right, you can see a African-American man being, it looks like, slapped by a white person as he's being hauled off by police. In all of the examples, we see only a small amount of people of color, so like two people, right, and a huge drove of white folks. These instances are what we call in ethnic studies pedagogic. They teach you something, right? And I want you to pause for a second and think about what this actually teaches you. So let's take a second, right? Okay. So notice that in all of these instances, there are large crowds. Those crowds are seeing these people of color being mistreated. If they already have preconceived notions about their criminality, about their expendability, or their just not worthiness, and they see these individuals being treated badly, right, then they're going to believe that that is okay, right? If you see something and see it enough, eventually you will believe that it's okay. And in the top two examples, what I want to be very clear about in these lynchings, there are young children at these events. So there are young children that are believing that people of color are bad, right, and therefore should be lynched. And that creates a preconceived notion about criminality. If we're thinking about how long lynching went on in the United States, down here, or in the middle, I provided a table from Ben Carrington's book, Forgotten Dead, where he compares lynchings between Mexicans and African Americans. These lynchings went up until the 1930s. I am 36 years old this year. My grandmother on my mom's side and on my father's side were both alive during this period. So these are individuals only a couple of generations back who saw this and held on to these ideas, right? And so they're very, very much a part of this imaginary. And one of the reasons why we want to say that race is maintained through violence is that the only way that we can continue to subordinate people, particularly people of color, is through violence, right? So we violently ripped Africans from their home on the continent of Africa and brought them here, subjected them to a horrific system of chattel slavery, which we'll talk about the following week. We did this in mass to Native Americans. We've done this in mass to Asian Americans. We've done this in mass to Latinos, or Latinx communities, so on and so forth, right? So it's been a big part of this. If we don't have a mechanism of violence that is going to, quote unquote, put people in their place, then there's no way that the racism works, right? So in this case, the way that race has not only been able to be established and proliferated is because we've created this understanding of human difference, right? That these BIPOC folks are inferior and can be mistreated violently, right? And that one gives this kind of, complex to white communities into society that how we treat people of color does not matter. And if we are violent to them, it is always justified and rationalized, right? So I'm going to show a video clip that's going to talk about this a little bit more. But before I get into that, I want to talk about two specific forms of violence that I think are very important to highlight. This idea of genocide and segregation. Both are violent, although one is indirect and one is direct. So genocide is much more direct, right? That's the systematic planned destruction of a racial, political, and or cultural group. We know this as the Jewish Holocaust. We've seen this happen in the Americas with indigenous communities. There's been lots of ethnic cleansing and ethnic projects all over the world, oftentimes within this kind of framework of racism, right? Segregation is also a form of violence. Whenever you confine a community to a separate area, the individuals who can segregate the other community, meaning that if there is a society with a dominant group that says another community has to live somewhere else, there's already a power structure in play, right? And that segregation denies, individuals who are in those segregated communities from, full access to society, right? Whether that be, again, cultural, economic, healthcare, whatever the resources are, right? So here we can see a little bit more on this example of racist violence in our society and how big or how ubiquitous it was and its effects.
I am a picker. It is my living and my avocation. I search out items that some people don't want or need, and then sell them to others who do. In America, everything is for sale, even a national shame. Until I came upon a postcard of a lynching, postcards seemed trivial to me, the way secondhand, misshapen Rubbermaid products might seem now. Ironically, the pursuit of these images has brought to me a great sense of purpose and personal satisfaction. Studying these photographs has engendered in me a caution of whites, of the majority, of the young, of religion, of the accepted. Perhaps a certain circumspection concerning these things was already in me, but surely not as actively as after the first sight of a brittle postcard of Leo Frank dead in an oak tree. It wasn't the corpse that bewildered me as much as the canine thin faces of the pack, lingering in the woods, circling after the kill. Hundreds of flea markets later, a trader pulled me aside and in conspiratorial tones offered to sell me a real photo postcard. It was Laura Nelson, hanging from a bridge, caught so pitiful and tattered and beyond retrieving, like a paper kite snagged on a utility wire. That image of Laura layered a pall of grief over all my fears. I believe the photographer was more than a perceptive spectator at lynchings. Too often, they compulsively composed silvery tableaux, nature morte, positioning and lighting corpses as if they were game birds shot on the wing. Indeed, the photographic art played as significant a role in the ritual as torture or souvenir grabbing, creating a sort of two-dimensional biblical swine, a receptacle for a collective sinful self. Lust propelled the commercial reproduction and distribution of the images, facilitating the endless replay of anguish. Even dead, the victims were without sanctuary. These photographs provoke a strong sense of denial in me and a desire to freeze my emotions. In time, I realize that my fear of the other is fear of myself. Then these portraits, torn from other family albums, become the portraits of my own family and of myself. And the faces of the living and the faces of the dead recur in me and in my daily life. I've seen John Richards alone on a remote county road, rocking along in hobby horse strides, head low, eyes to the ground, spotting coins or rocks or roots. And I've encountered Laura Nelson in a small, sturdy woman who answered my knock on a back porch door. In her deep-set eyes, I watched a silent crowd parade across a shiny steel bridge, looking down. And on Christmas Lane, just blocks from our home, I've observed another Leo, a small framed boy with his shirt tail out and skull cap off center, as he made his way to Sabbath prayers. With each encounter, I can't help thinking of these photos and the march of time and of the cold steel trigger in the human heart.
So the reason why I show this and what I want to be very clear about with lynching postcards is one, clearly people glamorized this whole process of inhumane and unjust and extralegal killing of African Americans in our society. Secondly, as you saw with many of the pictures, there was huge crowds and lynchings were publicized as a kind of event, right? People would take dates there, they would take small children there, so on and so forth. These were not just backwoods people that would engage with this very dark, heinous, and frankly illegal act, right? With that though, and like with all racist violence in our society, it is done, you know, for the most part out in the open and is not very much handled with the type of care and concern that it should, right? And that would also bespeak the nature of the racist society that we live in, where you know, individuals, you know, huge mobs go out and, you know, brutally kill people of color in a variety of contexts, and so much so, even, you know, if we want to bring up a George Floyd example, right? People watch as a police officer knelt in the neck of somebody for 9 minutes, right? This idea of that happening, and we don't really challenge that, right? Either because the person doing it has the power to do so with impunity, and we are in a precarious position to stop them, or unable to stop them, and or right, there are individuals doing these acts in mass, right, without any concern for you know, social stigma and or, you know, repercussions from law enforcement, right? And so where does this come from, right? It is this understanding that we've had racism and racist legislation be a part of our American imaginary. So I wanted to bring up a few key notable racist legislation. They're not going to be totally in historical order, but I wanted to open up first at the top here with the 13th Amendment. Part of the reason why I wanted to bring this up specifically is that a lot of folks believe that we live in a society where slavery has ended and that we've moved towards much more equality. I'm not saying us in this class, but I'm just saying that that is kind of where we've thought of ourselves as an American society. And we saw this a lot, specifically with Precious Knowledge, with Tom Horn and John Hubbenthal believing that, you know, America was the land of the great, and, you know, we have no ills at this point. But the 13th Amendment to the United States, and, you know, the kind of privileging of the Emancipation Proclamation as this touchstone of our American progress, I think is false, right? Because if you look at the language here, right? So neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof a party shall be duly convicted, shall exist in the United States. So we don't have slavery and voluntary servitude in the United States unless you are convicted of a crime. So that doesn't mean that we got rid of slavery. It just said that I can't privately buy you, right, as a slave, right? There, we don't have this informal system of slavery. We don't have an individual system of slavery, but we still have a systemic system of slavery that is within the actual criminal justice system. A few others here to note are the Indian Removal and Appropriation Act. In 1830, we passed laws to remove people from their lands and also to take their lands, right? So this is specifically targeting indigenous people. The Greaser Act of 1855, Greaser was actually a racial slur used against Mexican Americans for a number of years up until the 1940s. Was the first, anti-Mexican legislation, and gave way to many of the alien land laws that we saw. There were the Black Codes during the late 1850s all the way up until the 1920s and 30s. Notably is Dred Scott, which is the case about, runaway slaves and having to be returned to the South. We had vagrancy laws and the convict leasing system. What we'll learn about in African American history as we get more deep into that is after slavery, the 13th Amendment propped up a system where various municipalities, counties, and states passed laws to essentially criminalize all aspects of Black behavior, in effect to incarcerate these individuals and then put them back into a system of slavery, right? Because if you are a individual post 1864, a freed Black person, but you are convicted of a crime, right, according to the 13th Amendment, you can be committed to slavery, even though it's not, or even though technically it's been abolished, right? Plessy versus Ferguson gives rise to the separate but equal clauses. So that's the justification around, separate but equal and segregation. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And when we get into immigration in our understanding Latinx history in the United States, we're going to see that many of the laws in the turn of the 20th century from 1880 up until 1920 had explicitly racist language in it, right? The California Alien Land Law, which denied undocumented or any immigrant from owning land. In 1924, the Hart-Celler Act created the racial quota system, so we were only allowing so many people to come in at that point. Executive Order 9066 is the Japanese internment camp law, or the executive order that allowed for Japanese individuals to be interred during World War II. From 1942 to 1945, we'd actually taken thousands of people and thousands of Japanese or Asian-looking people from their homes and put them in internment camps during the time. And I want to be very clear that many folks from around the world have made the clear connection between Japanese internment camps and then Jewish internment camps. Although I will say that there wasn't the concerted effort to kill Japanese Americans and Japanese folks in internment camps, as we saw with the Nazis. The conditions and the camps themselves were very akin to those used by Nazi Germany. We had the Mexican Repatriation Program and Operation Wetback. Both of these programs in 1929 and 1954 led to mass deportations. The Mexican repatriation program after World War I sent 500,000, some estimate more closer to 1 million Mexican-looking people back to Mexico. And some have shown that about 2/3 of the people sent back during that time were actually American citizens. They were not, in fact, Mexican citizens. And one thing I want to note about Operation Wetback in 1954 is that wetback was not a common racial slur to be used against individuals. You may have heard this before. There were a variety of racial slurs used against Mexican Americans, including greaser, as I mentioned earlier, so on and so forth. When Harry Truman passed this particular law, we saw the emergence of wetback as a racial slur, and it created this particular cultural touchstone where basically laws gave, when laws used very explicitly racist language, that gave kind of the freedom of individuals to use that as well. So if it's in the law, right, then it's okay to call people that, right? The last thing I wanted to note was Operation Hold the Line and Gatekeeper. These ones, these particular operations and or policies gave rise to the border wall. So Operation Hold the Line was in Texas, Operation Gatekeeper was in San Diego. So the construction of border wall emerged in 1990, which again has led to mass issues as we've seen recently with the mistreatment of Haitian immigrants, right? And the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, like with Operation Wetback, gave rise to the term illegal immigrant and illegal alien. And in both of these cases, we started to see the specific mistreatment of not only just Mexicans, but sorry, not just Mexican-looking individuals or brown folks, but these folks that we perceived as being undocumented in mass, right? And so again, from 1830 up until 1990, there has been a concerted effort to pass very racist policies that are leading to the types of outcomes that I've been talking about, throughout this lecture. This presented particular conditions where we see these kind of racist caricatures. So I pulled these out from when the US was fighting the Spanish-American War, and we were starting to take hold of various territories in the Caribbean and in the Asia-Pacific region. So as you can see on the left here, this kind of hurrah for the 4th of July, Hawaii, Cuba, and the Philippines are all kind of marching together. But if you notice in this particular caricature, what I think is very important is that they're all dark skinned, right? So this kind of blackening of their individual bodies. And they're all seen as kind of these poor, wayward children, right? If we move over to the next picture with Uncle Sam here, and then obviously Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, and that should say the Philippines. I know it's hard to read on there, but that's what this individual is supposed to be seen as. We see, again, this kind of inferiorization, making them all seem like children, that, Uncle Sam is the kind of civilized, dignified individual, and even Puerto Rico trying to essentially be like Uncle Sam, but not as such, right? Because he's still dark skinned, so on and so forth. So again, we see this, kind of time and again of racializing or in this case, infantilizing or making them these countries in total childlike, right? And lastly, we have this kind of understanding of Uncle Sam as this circus leader with folks from the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, so on and so forth. And what's really particularly interesting about this one, looking at the long arc of all three of these caricatures, is in this case, they're kind of seen as animalistic, right? So they have humanist features, but they're almost seen as like kind of monkeys. And Uncle Sam is kind of the ringleader of this, right? And so in all of these cases, in all of this kind of long sordid history, there's this creation of regions of communities of populations as inferior. And as I kind of made mention with this sense of blackness and whiteness that undergirds our society, and has structured the particular way that we see individuals, all of these groups are kind of seen as, Black in their skin tone, right? So they've all been made to be seen as dark, and because of that, right, they're seen as backwards, they're seen as less than, so on and so forth, particularly in comparison to the US. So that gives way to this understanding of various forms of racism that are in our society. I provided this kind of model on the right here to explore that a little bit further. So one thing is that we have to realize is that racism operates at several levels in our society. Societal institutions and practices, as well as individuals, are impacted by racist ideologies, and it really leads to these different life chances and social outcomes for people of color compared to whites, right? And that involves housing, criminal justice, public health, and education here. We can see this in various layers and levels, right? So systemic is the kind of first, and that's ongoing racial inequalities maintained in a society, right? Institutional racism is discriminatory policies and practices within that organization or institution that lead to those inequalities, right? We have interpersonal racism, which is biases shown between individuals that would, through word and action, and then this internalized belief that that people of color are less than. So the way that we can fully understand this and understand this a bit further is that when the society itself is racist and there's all of these ongoing racist outcomes, these don't come from nowhere, right? So there are institutional policies and practices that ensure that there are those different outcomes. That also stems from this idea of interpersonal racism, which comes from people believing that folks are different. And that's obviously because they've internalized some kind of ideology that has made them believe that, people are different, right? And that, people of color are less than. I wanted to show this piece by the New York Times, which I've linked to here. This report on the upshot really is fascinating. So it came out a couple of years ago, 2018 specifically, and it showed how extensive racism is when we think about the life chances of Black and white boys. So the New York Times basically studied a big cohort of several thousand Black and white young boys and tried to show that whether they started out rich or poor, whites would always end up on top and African Americans would end up on bottom. And so what we can see here in this model is all of these individuals that grew up rich. So white boys are going to be in yellow and Black boys are going to be in blue. Okay, so of all of these individuals that grew up rich, they're going to kind of get organized into these other categories. So rich adults, upper middle class adults, lower middle class adults, and poor adults. Okay, so within a couple seconds of watching this, so we're already up to almost 4,000 boys who grew up rich families, right? Of that, 21% of those people, or of those 21% of African Americans who started out rich ended up poor, right? Where only 18% of them started out wealthy. If you see in the converse, though, of that population, only 10% of whites ended up poor, where 38% of them stayed fairly wealthy. So what this shows us is that when white people start out rich, they most likely stay rich, right? When Black folks start out rich, they actually will still likely end up being poor, which does not allow for this argument that race and wealth will automatically help you get out of discrimination. Rather that even if you grow up rich, you still will face discrimination and have different life outcomes compared to whites. And this is of 10,000 total families in the United States across the country. Okay, so I wanted to show that first. So these are folks that grew up rich And of that, almost 40% of whites who grew up rich stayed rich, where only 10% of them ended up poor. Of the folks of African Americans who started out rich, almost 60% of them ended up, significantly lower in the class structure, either middle class, working, lower middle class, or poor, right? Here's the bigger kicker. They also studied 10,000 families who were poor, right? And so what we can see almost immediately in the same tome is whites will start to outpace African Americans in terms of becoming rich from starting out poor, right? So even if you are poor, right, for the most part, you will stay poor. We can see this here in terms of overall numbers, right? So 40% African Americans who start out poor stay poor, about 50%, I'm sorry, 30% of whites who start out poor stay poor. But up top, right, we see about 10% of whites who started out poor became rich, where only 2% of African Americans did, right? So if this is the land of equal opportunity, we should see comparable numbers across contexts. That's not what we're seeing, right? If you started out rich and you're African American, you're actually more likely to end up lower on the class structure, and particularly poor. If you start out poor as an African American, it is extremely unlikely that you'll end up rich, where it is a little bit more likely that you'll end up rich if you are white, right? And even across other numbers, right? Upper middle class, and lower middle class, all of these young boys who were poor ended up with completely different life outcomes, where whites ended up being able to ascend class positions much more likely, where African Americans could not essentially escape from being lower middle class. There were less middle class African American boys or men, right? Even less upper middle class African American men, right, and rich, where you see higher numbers for whites across that context, right? So when we're talking about policies and practices that create these conditions, this is what I mean. This is what it looks like, right? So next, I want to kind of get into forms of racism that justify or enable this. So the first is this idea of scientific racism. And we have talked a little bit about this, so it shouldn't be totally brand new or a refresher. But here, what I've provided you with on the right are some examples of textbooks that try to argue these differences in man, right? So you have all of this kind of Mongolian population or this Asian population up here. Everybody's a different shade of white, where you have this kind of Caucasian or Caucasoid region, with some various white-looking individuals. So these folks in the center and everybody else is kind of a lighter shade of brown, but clearly different from these folks, right? This other textbook example I thought was really interesting, and they're trying to make I think an argument stating that African Americans are basically the missing link between man and monkey. So here's a monkey skull, here's an African American, here's an African American skull, and then here is a white person and a white skull, right? And so each example gives us a different kind of association with humanity and or biological inferiority and superiority. You can see it here a little bit more on the right. The next video example I'm going to show you really gets into the weeds on this, with a gentleman named Samuel Morton, who follows a lot of the kind of thinking that we've seen in racial formations and with Carl Linnaeus in trying to organize people of color in this kind of social order of being inferior, and then that also being used to inform different policies.
Native American skull was collected from the battlefields of the Second Seminole War in the mid-1830s. The neat bullet hole provides a lasting reminder of what happened to those who fought to defend their homeland in 19th century Florida. This is just one of 78 illustrations of native North and South American skulls featured in Samuel George Morton's Crania Americana, published in Philadelphia in 1839. It is undoubtedly the most important book in the history of scientific racism. The 19th century was a period in which science was increasingly used to justify racist ideas. In a claim typical of these developing racial sciences, Morton wrote of Native Americans that the structure of his mind appears to be different from that of the white man. The idea that Native Americans could not integrate into modern industrial society was central to both Morton's argument and also President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. From the passage of this act in 1830 onwards, Native American people, including the Seminoles featured in Crania Americana, had been forcibly relocated to the west of the Mississippi River. Within a few years, Crania Americana had been read in the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and India. James Cowles Pritchard, the foremost British anthropologist, described it as an exemplary work, whilst Charles Darwin also considered Morton an authority on the subject of race. My research here at the University of Cambridge looks to explain how Crania Americana became so influential, not just in the United States, but in Europe and beyond. How could a book with a print run of just 500 copies make such an impact? This research is crucial for understanding the ways in which racist theories gain credibility. Particularly in Europe, scholars tended to view American science with suspicion. Morton had to work hard to convince his peers across the Atlantic Ocean that Crania Americana should be taken seriously. It was the illustrations which really helped establish Morton's reputation in Europe. To create the eerie, naturalistic look we find in these images, Morton's artists used a new technique called lithography. The artists first drew each image onto a limestone block in wax before chemically fixing the image, inking, and printing. The limestone allowed the artists to create this textured effect, reproducing the subtle contours of each skull in Morton's collection. This texture also allowed men in Europe, like James Cowles Pritchard, to make the perverse claim that Native American skulls were actually of a different consistency to Europeans.
So I want to stop right there. I encourage you to watch more of the video on your own time, but that point right there, that this layered effect or this advance in technology was used specifically to make this argument of indigenous or native folks inferiority against bespeaks, one, the long legacy of racism informing a lot of thinking, you know, specifically scientific thinking, but also the complexities of how these things were happening and what it was doing in terms of not only informing policy, but the thinking about indigenous people, right? So them, you know, folks basically seeing these, you know, images in textbooks, having that being marketed all over the world, being adopted by other thinkers, and then that creating this really false understanding of indigenous inferiority, right? So this also gives rise to this idea of what we now know as medical racism. So scientific racism, like with medical racism, come from, you know, obviously a scientific lens. We now see a medical system, right, where it's structured and it's individually and systematically, or systemically favors whites. We've seen this in terms of the outcomes, particularly with COVID, right? There's been much more infection rates and death rates or hospitalization rates for people of color early on, and we still have issues in terms of vaccination for communities of color because of a longstanding mistrust with the system. Multiple studies reinforce this idea of racial bias. We've seen lots of inaction in terms of getting folks into medical school and other types of situations where African Americans and or people of color can be the thinkers and the leaders on this. And I wanted to show this video clip that really gets into this idea of how this long history of racism in the medical sciences has now created this idea of medical racism or different outcomes for people of color within the healthcare system, but also created this kind of odd distrust that people of color have with the system in of itself, right? And how people of color, or this distrust that people of color have with the system actually stems from the BIPOC folks being used for experimentation against their will in various ways.
Park in Manhattan. There's a bronze statue of a doctor named James Marion Sims, whose brilliant achievement carried the fame of American surgery throughout the entire world. He's the guy who created the vaginal speculum, an instrument gynecologists use for examination. He pioneered the surgical repair for fistula, a complication from childbirth, and became known as the father of modern gynecology. But that brilliant achievement was the result of a series of excruciating experimental surgeries that he conducted on enslaved women. In a lot of ways, Sims epitomizes the story of American medicine for Black women. It's a system that's failing them to this day. From infant mortality to life expectancy, the racial disparities in healthcare are staggering. The gulf between Black and white might be widest when we look at maternal mortality, with Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with pregnancy or birth than white women. And that divide can be traced back to doctors like Sims, who contributed to a long, largely overlooked history of institutional racism in medicine.
Trying to understand a historical problem without knowing its history is like trying to treat a patient without eliciting a thorough medical history. You're doomed to failure.
That's Harriet Washington, a medical ethicist and author who chronicled the intersection of race and medicine in her book, Medical Apartheid. While many of the stark racial disparities in healthcare can be attributed to environmental and economic factors like access to good healthcare, studies show that minority patients tend to receive a lower quality of care than non-minorities, even when they have the same types of health insurance or the same ability to pay for care.
As African Americans, we've been abused for so long, consistently by the system. Why should we trust it? Why should we go to it when ill? And that's iatrophobia. That's a fear of the healer, inculcated by the behavior of those healers, unfortunately.
It starts with slavery. Doctors relied on slave owners for financial stability. They accompanied plantation masters to auctions to verify the fitness of slaves and were called in to treat sick slaves to protect their owners' investments. In 1807, Congress abolished the importation of slaves and in turn pushed Black women to have more children, to essentially breed slaves. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson later wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm." Around the 1830s, the abolitionist movement led to the rise of what was called Negro medicine, or efforts to identify Black inferiority to justify slavery. And there were polygenists who tried to use both science and the Bible to find proof that races evolved from different origins. The 1830s also marked the beginning of recorded experimentation on Black women's bodies. One doctor performed experimental C-sections on slaves. Another one perfected the dangerous ovariotomy, or removal of an ovary by testing the procedure on slave women. In fact, half the original articles in the 1836 Southern Medical and Surgical Journal dealt with experiments on Black people. And then, of course, there was James Marion Sims, whose reputation is etched in history and on that statue in Central Park. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims began performing experimental surgeries on a 17-year-old slave named Anarcha. He eventually performed 30 operations on Anarcha and more surgeries on about 11 other female slaves. When his male colleagues could no longer bear to assist him in inflicting pain on the women, the slaves took turns restraining one another. Yet paintings depicting Sims, Anarcha, and other slave women presented a subdued version of his experiments. Even though anesthesia was introduced in 1846, Sims chose not to use it for his experimentation with slaves. His practices echoed one of the most prevalent and dangerous beliefs in medicine at the time, that Black people did not feel pain or anxiety. This book from 1851, titled The Natural History of Human Species, claimed the American dark races bear with indifference tortures insupportable to a white man. Studies released as recently as last year demonstrate that Black people are less likely to be treated for pain, particularly in the ER. There's even one from a children's hospital that found the same to be true for kids. And just this year, Pearson Education, a leading educational publisher, issued an apology and recalled nursing textbooks that included racist stereotypes, like this section that said Black people often report higher pain intensity than other cultures.
So again, what we see here is a long history of the creation of people of color as less than, right? And even in this case, although, you know, what we're seeing is an assumption of pain tolerance, right? It's creating a condition where folks are not getting the access to care and treatment that they needed. And whether we're looking at the experimentation, the use of medical sciences and medical practitioners to justify slavery, all of that, again, enmeshes this idea of race and racism. So moving on, right, we now have this understanding of what are called institutional and systemic racism. So medical and scientific racism in many ways justifies or enables this idea of institutional and systemic racism, which is the existence of systematic policies or laws that provide differential access to goods, services, and opportunities of a society by race, right? So in healthcare, right, we're seeing that. In other cases, we see this too. I bring back this information about policing, where we see higher arrest rates for marijuana possession in 25 most states, where African Americans are being arrested at higher rates comparatively, and they're getting more jail time compared to whites, right? And other kinds of, and less likely to have time served or other types of lesser punishments. And then they're also getting more jail time overwhelmingly, right? So here we can see 0 years, 1 to 25 years, 25 to 60 years. Everybody, African Americans outweigh higher prison sentences than whites in the higher categories, right? This next clip is going to kind of show what these policies look like in terms of housing, policing, and education, which again will reinforce this idea of institutional practices.
Luther King stood for nonviolence. Now what's Martin Luther King? A street. And I don't give a fuck where you in America. If you're on Martin Luther King Boulevard, there's some violence going down.
That, of course, is Chris Rock's famous joke about streets named for Martin Luther King Jr., which tend to be in, let's say, distressed areas. And he's not wrong, because if you look at the way housing segregation works in America, you can see how things ended up this way. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Okay, let's look at MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. I want to show you how to see housing segregation in schools, in health, in family wealth, in policing, but first, an explanatory comma. It's the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. FDR is president. He wants to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of that New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. So now you have all these lower income people who can afford homes, but how do you make sure they don't default on their new mortgages? Enter the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC created residential security maps, and these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from. Green meant best area, best people, aka businessmen. Blue meant good people like white collar families. Yellow meant a declining area with working class families. And red meant detrimental influences, hazardous like foreign born people, low class whites, and most significantly, Negroes. Again and again on these HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for redline neighborhoods is the presence of Black and brown people. Let's be clear, studies show that people who lived in redlined areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. So landlords abandon their properties, city services become unreliable. In most places, crime increases. and property values drop. All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to Black people, and all of this was perfectly legal. Now it's 1968, and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39
Apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
In the aftermath, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race or religion or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters, but it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced. So you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any US city, like its effects on wealth. So home ownership is the major way Americans create wealth, right? Well, discrimination in housing is the major reason that Black families up and down the income scale have a tiny fraction of the family wealth that white families do, even white families with less education and lower incomes. For almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers. Not only were Black neighborhoods redlined, and not only was the Fair Housing Act selectively enforced, if at all, but it is still today much harder for a Black person to get a mortgage or home loan than it is for a white person.
Families are fearful of speaking up about a basic human right that should be afforded to everyone in the world, but definitely in the richest country in the world.
And housing segregation in schools. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is by paying property taxes. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, better school facilities, and more resources. Here's the feedback loop. The better the schools in a neighborhood, the more those homes in that neighborhood are worth. And the higher the property values of those homes, the more money there is for schools, and so on and so on. And housing segregation in health. Because of urban planning that benefited those richer, whiter neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near industrial plants that spew toxic fumes. They're more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food, and in places where the water isn't drinkable. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure and in homes with toxic paint.
When you're living with rats, roaches, and things like that, that's the problem. You cannot have that kind of stuff with children running around in a building that may be full of lead.
And not coincidentally, people of color have higher incidences of certain cancers, asthma, and heart disease. And housing segregation in policing. Housing segregation means we are having vastly different experiences with crime and vastly different experiences with policing. Because our neighborhoods are so segregated, sometimes racial profiling can be camouflaged as spatial profiling, where living in certain areas can make you more likely to be stopped by the police. And it means that people have a lot of unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system just because of where they live.
So what this tells us, and like I said with earlier examples, is that the history of race and the history of now racism, as we've been exploring with this lecture, creates these conditions, right? Policies that prevent people from living together, that enable their mistreatment, as we saw with the healthcare example, exposure to certain toxins that lead to different health outcomes and their inability to access healthcare, their greater exposure to police in this example, right? Connectedly, so on and so forth, right? And so what that gives rise to is this understanding of interpersonal racism, right? So this is the one that's most well known. This is what we've kind of understood as people, saying racist things to one another, right? Racism can range though from something called microaggressions all the way up until hate crimes, right? And with a microaggression, these are just kind of small statements or actions that are usually indirect or subtle, but are still discriminatory, right? And I've shown you some examples here on the right. Where are you from? This understanding of maybe an individual not being really seen as American, trying to understand them as being foreign, right? You don't act like a normal Black person. What do your people think about this? You speak English so well. I had that happen to me a lot as being Latino. we don't want to pronounce your name, can we just call you something that's anglicized, right? Or why do you sound so white? Hate crimes, on the converse, are the much more heinous form of this, right? Which are much more aggressive, right? So this is any kind of crime motivated against a person because of their race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity, right? So a lot more direct and violent, right? And then lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about internalized racism. And this has been a bit more harder to flesh out because we are seeing this in two ways. One, we see this with individuals having an internalized understanding of difference, right? And that follows along this long history that we've been talking about over the past couple of weeks. But this also has very deleterious effects on BIPOC folks. And I mentioned here, right, that people of color will actually accept these problematic assumptions about themselves and engage in either distancing or self-harm. And it largely stems from this idea that BIPOC folks can't get access to wholesome representations of people of color. And this is true also for whites, because if people of color are not finding these good representations, right, then nor are whites. And this last clip really fleshes this out. This is from the black white doll experiment. So this was used in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case. This was actually reproduced fairly recently and had very similar results.
Pizza or salad? Which one do you think I'm having for dinner tonight? Well,
it was an experiment that changed the course of U.S. history, helping to desegregate schools. And all it took were some kids and some baby dolls. Now, more than 60 years later, would the results be any different? Will Uick has that story.
I don't really know what about it stuck with me.
Texas A&M assistant professor Dr. Tony Sturdivant first heard about Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark's doll experiments as an undergrad and has been thinking about it ever since.
I remember wondering if things were different, what would happen.
The study questioned over 200 African-American children from 3 to 7 years old about black and white baby dolls.
We're saying things like, give me the doll that you would like to play with, or give me the doll that looks bad.
What they found was startling.
2/3 of the children selected the white dolls for positive attributes and the black dolls for negative attributes.
The study showed that children as early as 3 are able to pick up on societal messages. And Dr. Kenneth Clark used that research as an expert witness in Brown versus Board of Education, demonstrating that separate but equal really wasn't equal when it generates a feeling of inferiority.
Some of the children actually were visibly upset with having to say that the black doll looked like them.
Now, more than 6 decades after that experiment, Dr. Sturdivant decided to see if anything has changed.
I didn't just include a white and black doll, I also included the Latina doll.
She observed a multiracial Texas school for a semester, 13 students, 4 dolls, and salon props.
Instead of asking children which one is the bad doll or whatever, I just placed the dolls in their classroom.
She took notes and followed up with some clarifying questions. And what she found,
black dolls were stepped on, black dolls were cooked in a pot,
was pretty much the same startling thing the Clarks found all those years ago.
The children still had this pro-white bias that the Clarks found earlier in their studies. So the black dolls had afro curly hair. So they would say, I don't want to play with that doll because it's curly.
Dr. Sturdivant says although school desegregation was a good first step and may have helped, the work is far from done. And one of the ways to help kids and society move forward
it's okay to talk to their kids about race and feel good about their background
is as simple and easy as talking.
We do have data to support that adult silence about race fosters feelings of anti-Blackness in not just Black children, but all children, because us children are always learning, always.
Will Uick, 3.
So just to kind of close on this, and this is the last part I really wanted to focus on, is this idea that, again, whether we're looking at the top all the way down to the bottom and all of these nuances, race and racism is very ubiquitous in our society and is actually leading to these different outcomes. And I think what the black white doll experiment shows us here is that it actually really does affect these children as it did 50 years ago, and it's happened many, many times before. So I just want to wrap. So we covered racism, we've looked at mechanisms of racism, forms of racism, again, scientific, medical, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. And our key term today is racism. So we'll talk more about this in the next lecture as we think about white supremacy. And I'm going to show much more contemporary effects of this across various social fields. Okay. So I look forward to talking more about this, and that's it.